Well, as you might guess, this is a video on the French defense. So, I hope you enjoy it and learn a lot. Okay, so let's get started on the French defense. As this video is for very much beginning players, I would say below a rating of 1,000, it requires some brief discussion about choosing your opening repertoire. I assume that if you're going to learn the French defense that you have a chess teacher and that they have decided that you should play the French defense for some good reason, and they're going to teach you various variations and traps within it over some time in the near future. So this video is just going to be the bare minimum to start playing it. Later on you should of course investigate further materials and possibly even consider other openings as black against e4. So very often we are told, oh, everybody's got to play this move or that move when they're a beginner, and they try to give you some reason. I've heard very strong players try to make a case that everybody should start with e4 and black should always play e5 against it for a while, or at least they insist that everybody's got to start as an e4 player, and then they give some reason. Well, the reason is because that's what they did. And I find that attitude especially prevalent among certain sectors of chess players. So I'll leave it at that. But there's nothing wrong with the French defense. Certainly not something I would recommend for everybody. It tends to be a rather defensive one. Now we have to have a little bit of a discussion about pawn structure in general. First of all, we need to know what is an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is a pawn where there's no pawn in the file beside it. An isolated pawn is weak in the sense that another pawn cannot possibly guard it. It can only be guarded by pieces, and also the square right in front of the pawn is potentially weak. Another type of a pawn weakness is the so-called doubled pawn. Not that these are all good moves here, but I'm just getting to a position where we could maybe show a doubled pawn. Let's suppose it went like this. And now black trades off his bishop pair, and white has this doubled pawn. Doubled pawns, one pawn is blocked by the other often. They also can never defend each other, and they sometimes have a benefit of an open file. Here this pawn will be a target, and it's not guarded right now. So double pawns in general are potentially a minus, even though Nigel Short says modern chess theory is too concerned about pawn structure when checkmate ends the game. And then another thing worth mentioning here is that we have this closed and blocked center here, and this is called a pawn chain. The pawn chain does not go back to here. The base of the pawn chain is considered to be the furthest back pawn that's blockaded here by black's pawn. Black's pawn chain similarly does not go back to here as the base. This is the base of black's pawn chain, and this is the base of white's pawn chain. So it's probably more important to talk about that with the French defense than just about any other opening that a beginner might be considering. So evaluation, what does that word mean? That means where we make an assessment, we decide how good is the position. Naturally, if you're losing, getting a draw would be a good result. You may find yourself in a situation where you must clearly decide between attempting to win, likely unsuccessfully, and attempting to draw, likely successfully. So there are a few different factors involved with evaluating your position. The most obvious all beginners are familiar with is where we just look at the pieces. And we don't really have to count up pieces. We can notice those that both players have, you know, what's the same, and say what's different. Here, white's got 2 bishops and black has 2 knights. We say that black has a knight for a bishop, but white has doubled pawns. The knight for the bishop is concerned with material. This is the pawn structure. The pawn structure and material are so-called permanent factors. They're relatively permanent. They change more slowly. They are a more stable and predictable indicator of who's doing better. Now, there's development. How active are your pieces? Are they near the center? How many of them are off the back row? King safety. Your kings are out here in the middle and your opponent's got a queen and a bunch of pieces hanging around, you're probably going to get checkmated. Especially in heavy piece endings where, you know, the minor pieces are gone, but we got queens and rooks roaming around. That's often all about king safety. So king safety, development, are some other factors that you will presumably learn as you move forward. So it's always important to consider pawn structure, but the more stiff the pawn structure is, the more immutable, and these block pawns, you know, this block of 4 pawns might be here for 20 moves. It's pretty hard to change it. And then I want to talk about open and closed center. In an opening like, say, the Scotch game, the center is opened up quite a bit right away. There's other openings where these pawns might be gone too. Here, white's got a half-open D file, half open from his side. White has a half-open E file. But the center is kind of open. See, both of these bishops can come out easily. That means that they can attack whatever they want, and that they have a lot of different options of places to go. That's not quite as true for black yet, but then remember, white got to move first. But when you have an open center, castling is an emergency almost every time. When you have a closed center, let's say we had instead, let's say we went into some ultra boring opening, and we'll say he did this and he went here, and, you know, very, very boring. In this kind of an opening where neither player can likely get their queen pawn open the center anytime soon, then the action is going to be on the sides of the board. And that tends to favor black a little bit because white usually can use his advantage in development more in a more open position, which is one of the reasons why the French defense may make sense. But with closed centers, castling might be something that you want to wait. You may want to wait and see which side your opponent castles on, and then decide, do you want to castle on the same side, opposite side, or not at all. But usually with an open center, you just want to castle before they do, before they get your king in trouble for not being castled. So that's probably about as much as we need to say about open and semi-open and closed, or open or a closed center. Now, you might have heard designations of an open or a closed position, which is sort of a subjective term open just means the pieces, bishops and rooks and queens, can move around a lot. When there's lots of pawns clogged up against each other, then knights tend to be better. But with openings, it can be a little confusing because we just generally refer to all openings that start with e4, e5 as quote-unquote open game, even though this could lead to a closed center. And if we have a position where maybe some files are open but not the others, let's say it's like this, and then he goes here, and then he takes, and he takes back. Not that these are good moves, I'm just trying to create the sort of center to talk about. This would be like semi-open because neither side has two open files, but black has one open from his side, white has one open from his side. You could call that semi-open. Of course, you could get something more open if, you know, let's say we had some opening like this, you know, and he goes here, and then he takes, and then he takes. We can get a very open center. But this still came from an opening, e4, e5, which is called open game. Sicilian, if white plays e4 and black does not play his king pawn 2 squares forward, then this is going to be called, as an opening classification, semi-open. That is the classification into which the Caro-Kann and the French defense fit in. And any move other than this, other than e5, when white plays e4, will be called semi-open. Now, if black had played a move like this, then this is what we call closed game, even if black plays d5, because neither player touched their king pawn. So this is called closed game, even though it is possible for the center to open up. So from there, we're going to delve into the history of the French defense very briefly. And okay, so by now you know that the French defense begins with white moving his king's pawn 2 squares forward from e2 to e4. See, e4. And then black moves his king's pawn up only 1 square forward, also to a white square. So the moves e4, e6 characterize the French defense. ECO stands for Encyclopedia of Chess Openings. So until you get a lot more serious about chess, you should just ignore that. You don't need to know about it yet. So the French defense is a chess opening characterized by the moves e4, e6, and almost every single time white plays d4 and then black plays d5. If not, it could actually transpose into a different opening. The word transpose, if you don't know what that means, just ignore that. You'll find out about it later. But the opening got its name, and usually it's a waste of time to find out how an opening got its name. We don't care much, but in this case we know it was because of a radio match between London and Paris from 1834 to 1836. I suppose the French Parisian players employed it often and did fairly well with it. So after a while it became known as the French defense. So, since this is an absolute beginner's guide to the French defense, I'm not going to ask an absolute beginner to memorize long lines with a lot of arcane moves that are difficult to understand. Just enough moves to define your opening choices. After that, you should go back and get a lot more detailed education on specific lines in French defense. So you do need to know how to play the French defense. After white plays e4, if he does, you can play e6. Now, if white were to play d4, which doesn't happen very often in kids' chess, you could still play e6 and hope for him to play e4, but that would imply some things about your d4 repertoire, that is the group of choices to make in the opening when white plays d4, the openings that you play. So, of course, white could play knight f3 here, in which case I would recommend the still played d5, but almost every time white is going to play d4. So let's go with this. Now let's suppose white does this, e5, advances his pawn. We call this the advance variation. That's what you should do. Immediately hit at the base of the pawn chain. White has spent an extra move without getting a new piece out, so black actually will have the initiative for a while. The initiative means that you continuously attack and force your opponent to just defend for a while. You set the tempo, so to speak. So, the advanced
Normally,
variation...
taking back is not allowed, but today's my generous day.
Yeah, let's move this over for a second so I can put this on infinite analysis so we won't have to hear that. Okay, another different move that black could make that white could make after you play d5, which you should do if he has e4 and d4 out there, is he could trade. And since your queen's bishop is often the only piece difficult to get out in the French defense, you can be happy about this and just capture this way, allowing your bishop out. So white often plays this when white is very much the weaker player and simply wants a draw due to all the exchanges on the file. So, going back to d5, so we had the advanced variation where you should play c5 immediately. If he takes, you take back, which you would probably do anyway. Don't take with your queen because he'll attack it with his knight. If white moves this knight, his queen's knight, you should play knight f6. Now you can make a case for playing c5 against the Terrache variation. When white moves his knight to d2 in front of his queen like he just did, that's called the Terrache variation, named after Dr. Sigbert Terrache. Part of the idea of that is to prevent this pin that we could get if the knight were on c3, which is a good move. Not the move I would recommend for you. So if he goes here, you can bring your knight out. If he plays knight c3, again, you'll bring your knight out. Anytime he attacks this knight with his pawn, you're not going to go up here, you're going to come back to d7. So that's what you need to know to start, is that as black, you're going to make these two moves. The purpose of e6 is to support this pawn at d5, just like black might do in the Caro-Kann, where he plays this pawn one square forward first and always follows it with d5. So there are some other things that white could do besides e4 and d4, but they would be beyond the scope of this beginner's discussion of the French defense, as this formation happens almost in every game of the French defense. and they're good moves. So if he moves his pawn up, the advanced variation, what do? You play c5. Hopefully you knew that before I said it. If white takes, you're going to take back. Okay? If he moves his queen's knight, you're going to move your knight here to this square. And if the knight is on this square and the pawn moves up to attack it, you'll move it back to d7. Aside from that, black is always wanting to get this c5 move in and to play this queen's knight to c6 and put pressure on these central dark squares and to open the c-file, eventually put a rook here and try to get in. The understanding of open files is useful here because these two pawns jammed against each other can form what we call a ram. Even if this pawn comes forward, this pawn is still blockaded. So if black wants to open the c-file, he can do it by moving this pawn up. Okay, so to go just a little bit further into some of these variations, let's just take a look at white making this move, which is very popular. Now there's nothing wrong with this move. It has a different name, so I'm not going to talk about the names just yet. You can go here. As I said before, if the pawn comes up, you just move the knight back like this. If he goes here, which is also a popular move, one thing you can do is to just unpin your knight. Again, if the pawn comes up, you'll just bring this back here. If he takes your bishop, you'll use your queen to take back, and soon you'll play c5. So that might look like this. I'm not going to really discuss the Alekhine Chattered gambit over there with h4. It doesn't happen very often, and that will certainly be part of a more advanced discussion on the French defense. Here I'm trying to only give the beginner what I think that they can remember and what could be useful to them. So let's go back and say that he made the other knight move, the tirage. Okay, like I said, c5 is a good move, but it can become a little bit complicated how to deal with the pawn structure in the center. I quite like this move. If he attacks your knight, you're going to come back here. A typical move for white might be to go here. And now that you have the knight and the bishop both guarding this, you can do this. White should try to make sure he keeps a pawn here so that he can make sure he keeps a pawn guarding this central pawn, because he wants to keep your light squared bishop out of the game. So after this, white typically gets another piece involved, and then white brings this knight here. If d4 needs more defense, now this knight can go here and defend as well for the third time. Okay, you might want to write down Milner-Barry, M-I-L-N-E-R-B-A-R-R-Y. Look up the Milner-Barry gambit when your chess teacher says you ought to, maybe after you've been playing the French defense for a while, or if someone tries to play it against you. It's a line played in the advanced variation. And truth be told, I don't have a lot of respect for white's exchange variation. It doesn't take advantage of black's crampedness very much. Every opening has pluses and minuses. The plus for black here is that he can make the center be very closed, and then he can open the c-file. But the minus part is that he can't put his knight on f6 for long, and he has less space on the king side, which white tends to use to try to attack him there. But let's say he plays the advanced variation. What should you do? Yes, c5 immediately. White should go here. If he doesn't go there, and he doesn't check you either, take this pawn with your pawn. This queen check here is rather silly. I only mention it because it's check, and beginners think that they should think about such moves. You should. Doesn't mean they're good. It is not good here. This is white's bad bishop, is dark squared bishop. This is black's bishop that's bad, his light squared bishop. So there are a few strategic considerations of the French defense that you should know before you go on to study it in more detail. So the French defense really is ideal for a good defensive player. The thing is you know, people don't like to think of themselves as a defensive player, and it's almost impossible for somebody else to know what you're really comfortable with, especially if you're not being very open with them. So I can't really use that too much, but just keep that in mind, because there's so many variations where black must assume a temporarily cramped position. Some masters have felt and tried to demonstrate that it's not sound. But ever and again, you know, the French keeps coming back. Most of black's problems are because of the difficulty in getting his queen's bishop out. That's his bishop that's on white squares. That explains why this opening has a lot in common with the queen's gambit and with the king's side. White usually tries to take advantage of his opponent's lack of room by a kingside attack, coupled with a cramping bind in the center. Black's defense consists of a central break and a judicious development. From time to time, it would appear that one side has the upper hand, but the balance always seems to be restored. One good merit of the French defense is that it gives us plenty of scope for imagination. After the natural d4 and d5, when we look at what's going on here with the pawn structure, we can see two things. White's center pawns are a little better because they're a little further forward. Both of his bishops are free. So he's out to keep the status quo that way, or to even improve it by advancing to e5 and to play f4 and so on. Eventually even play the f4 pawn to f5. That's white's break, where his pawn here goes from here to here to here. These are basics to understand, so that when you study particular concrete variations in the French defense, which later on you may be able to remember, that'll help you more. I'm not a big fan of memorizing long lines of moves where the student doesn't really understand either side's moves. Then as soon as the other person does something weird, they're completely lost. Black has a cramped position, but he can free himself with the move c5, and that's what he's always aiming for. It really is vital for black in that defense. So to get started in the French defense, you have to remember your basic getting started moves after white makes his third move. He's going to either move his king's pawn or the queen's knight. All other moves are not really good. If he moves his bishop here, white will trade pawns and then attack the bishop with a gain of tempo by developing this knight. Also, his queen will have access to white's pawn here, and he'll certainly play c5 soon and may have a chance to completely tear up white's center. So on e5, you play c5. If he takes, you take back. If he moves his knight to c3, play knight f6. Here's how the advanced variation might go if we take it a little bit further. Let's say he goes here, and now white starts piling on the pressure on d4, moves his queen out here. The bishop can come out here. There's a little trap here. It looks like white can win a pawn. He can't. I might talk about that in another video later on. But for now, as black, just play this move. Okay, let's look at that one more time. Now this is video, so you can go back and watch it as many times as you like. But on the advanced variation, These are good moves for both sides and very typical. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the knight c3 line. And let's take a look at that. Now, black can trade pawns here, but I don't really like that for black. I don't want him to liquidate the only pawn, that is trade off the only pawn he's got in the center, leaving white as the only one with a pawn in the center. But there are some reasons why black may want to do that. It's a little past the scope of this video. Black could play this move immediately, but I'm not recommending that for beginning players. I recommend that you play this knight f6 move. Now, as I said before, if he moves the pawn up, you're going to come back here with your knight, and over the next few moves, you're going to try to lay siege to d4 as before. And of course, if he takes, you develop another piece by getting your bishop out. Sometimes you have this knight a4 move to worry about if you have your queen and bishop here, but if your bishop is holding on to that square, you don't need to worry. Often the queen can give a check. So this is about how this may continue here. And one more time with the Tarrasch variation, which is this for white. Okay, I'm going to recommend this move, and typical would be this. As I say, the knight responds to an attack by the pawn at e5 by moving himself from f6 to d7. This knight's going to go here when he goes. The queen's knight should not block this pawn, not normally. So a typical move from there may be, say, d3, c5, c3, knight c6, right? But for now, just try to memorize the first 3 or 4 moves. Don't memorize any move that you don't understand yet. And if you have a chess teacher, certainly ask them whether or not they believe that choosing the French defense is an appropriate decision for you. And of course, if you play it well and get good results with it, then the proof's in the pudding. So hopefully that has helped you to get an idea of what the French is and where it comes from, how it fits into chess, and whether or not you may want to choose it, what the French defense is, and what the very beginning moves of it are. This does not prepare you to play against the player who knows all about the French defense, not at all. So if you want to learn more about the French defense, let me know. I am Chris at chrischess.com. Also, you can go to chrischess.com to get in touch with me. Thanks for watching.